Follow-up series can be difficult, and especially one with some pretty bold changes that make it just sound like it's not going to work on paper. Absolutely blown away by the second Chronicles of Thomas Covenant. Hello and welcome to my channel. In this video, we're going to be talking about the second Chronicles of Thomas Covenant the Unbeliever, which consists of the Wounded Land and the One Tree and White Gold Wielder. And this is a follow-up, which was a pretty fast follow to the initial Chronicles of Thomas Covenant the Unbeliever, which I have talked about. I recently did a series spotlight talking about the first trilogy, and I've been really meaning to get to the second trilogy for quite some time. So I did do a review for The Wounded Land and kind of just talking about my thoughts there with picking it up, and later then mentioned that the One Tree really did bring that something extra, but this really is one of those follow-ups that kind of sounds like it shouldn't work, and for me, it absolutely did. This takes place 3,000 years in the land after the first one, and I should note that if you're not crazy familiar, it's this portal fantasy, so our character Thomas Covenant going into the land. Time had passed in the first trilogy as well, but it's been 3,000 years since Thomas Covenant has been there, is the first change, and everything is very different because he finds that the land is under the power of something called the Sunbane, and so all of the land as we know it is gone. Instead of this vibrant place full of life, it's this desolate landscape, and we see that pretty much everything else has changed and been corrupted and twisted. And so that's kind of our start, is huge time jump and the land completely different when that's what so many people fell in love with in the first trilogy. And then also we introduce a new character, Dr. Lyndon Avery, to go along with Thomas Covenant and be introduced as just kind of another character there, and a potential love interest, which sounds like absolutely also should not work at all with Thomas Covenant being who he is. But for me, I think works incredibly well also with those changes. And so this is one of those, I think, follow-ups that just does a really fantastic job. Now, I don't know. I've heard some people say that they like this more than the original. I really think this was phenomenal, and I really, really enjoyed this thoroughly. And it has elevated the whole series for me as well. Although I don't quite know, because the first trilogy, the highs are so high, and although the highs are very high here as well, I don't know that it quite jumps that far. But gosh, the fact that I even have to have that conversation and think about it is a pretty good sign. So this one, I will note, starts out, like I said, the Wounded Land picks up and so many things have changed. And then it also felt like it was just missing a little bit of what the series does, because Thomas Covenant in this series, and Donaldson in general, it's so big with the bigger picture, the themes, and how all of these things intersect and connect. And there's that kind of extra thing going on. It's more than just the basic story that's happening, and that's something he excels with. Now, I will say with the first trilogy as well, I wasn't entirely sold by Lord Phallus Bane. It was the Ill Earth War that really started to bringing a lot of those themes to light, and then the final book that really brought it home. And here, the same thing too. The One Tree was phenomenal. It also took some really bold choices, because it sees us leaving the land, going elsewhere, going on a quest as well, and things not quite turning out necessarily the way that you think. And then White Gold Wielder with bringing it back really full circle, and just an incredibly satisfying ending. I think I just ever so slightly, the One Tree I think is a slightly above White Gold Wielder for me, despite how good of an ending White Gold Wielder is. But I just really, really loved the way that the One Tree paralleled with some items from the first trilogy. So those are kind of some general thoughts talking here. And really, I think if you enjoyed the first trilogy, you absolutely need to check this out. This is actually, even though it's a follow-up, this feels like it's a really important part to add and continue what was started in the first trilogy. And the events of the first trilogy are still incredibly relevant here in both in our characters inside as well as in the land. And this is kind of in a way like seeing the other side of a coin, seeing everything corrupted, everything changed, and how that changes things and how that's going to work. And with so much of the first one with Covenant, the whole idea being him with leprosy, and then in this place that's so vibrant, full of life, and the dichotomy there, and all of the looks of action versus inaction and those changes. And now we're seeing things a little bit differently as Covenant returns, because he can't help but know that in some ways the land is real, even though he's steadfastly not believed it initially in the first trilogy. But also it's all of the land, all of the beauty that, despite him having trouble really appreciating it in the first trilogy, when it's all gone, it's so easy to notice that it's there. And then thematically, we also look at some other themes here as well. We're still looking at action and reaction and inaction and all of those things as well, which are big things. But also a big thing that's talked about here is the idea of possession, taking over somebody, taking away their free will, and how horrible that is something to do, and how it's just a very terrible thing, which also, of course, naturally plays back to when we, in the first book, kind of the inciting incident, which is still very relevant with what happened to that character as well, where that's, you know, definitely a form of a kind of possession and taking away somebody's bodily autonomy in that way as well. And so it really does play in, continues to show that, but in a different way. And the ultimate ending here, I think, is also very satisfying. Now, I will say too, there are some climaxes throughout the series in these three books that kind of almost remind me of Abercrombie, with the way that it's not what you expect, where it's kind of the quote-unquote unsatisfying or anticlimactic ending, but in a way that for me is accomplished much better by Donaldson in these books than Abercrombie tends to do with that sort of thing, where it just comes off as sarcastic, whereas here it comes off as more tragic. And so there's just so many strengths throughout this. Now, there are some things that I will say that are very much Donaldson things, and some of it I feel like it's gotten slightly worse. He does really overuse certain vocab words, as the library letter would say, the obscure vocab words, quite a lot. And I joked about this in one of my videos. It's like venison and percipients, and there are some others that he just uses constantly. One that came up in the later books, anodyne, a lot too. There's just so many things he uses and overuses some of these words, which minor annoyance, but something that I enjoyed. Donaldson does some really great prose overall, and there's some really beautiful passages in here, as always with his books, but some of those got a little bit annoying. And I think the reason too that this book 2 slightly edged out book 3 for me with this is because you do get just a little bit too much of the "don't you see" moments, where it's like, you know, kind of explaining that of course it has to work that way, and so some of that ends up feeling just a little bit contrite to me when we're kind of doing that over and over again with Covenant kind of coming to some realizations. Although there are some really powerful character moments where he does come to some realizations, and the way that this ends is also, I don't think anybody would really see coming. And I was so curious the whole time because of the way that the first trilogy ends, which was that last book, The Power That Preserves, is seriously just a tragic and a beautiful and an amazing book overall. And White Gold Wielder doesn't quite hit there for me, but ending wise, you have to do something pretty different to make it work, and I think it really, really accomplished that. And so this is such a strong follow-up series for me, with both the first book, the establishing of kind of like the upside down, sideways, other side of the coin, however you want to say it, just the land being incredibly different, all of the lore, everything twisted, corrupted, the way we revisit and add more context to some things from the first book, just how tragic it is knowing what was there in the first book. We get to see, although we're not seeing obviously, you know, familiar characters in the same way because of the fact that so much time has passed. We see different types, you know, where we see giants, we see other creatures, we see things from the first, we see how things have changed. And I have to say, like I said, it works. It just really, really does. Covenant comes off as almost a sympathetic character here, which is something that's kind of surprising to say because of the fact that he is a very unlikable character. And he still is here, and he still has plenty of the woe is me type of thing. His leprosy is still there. There's still a lot of that turmoil inside of him. You know, but he remains the character who's kind of partially the driving force. But the thing is, he does in some ways take a backseat to the new character, Lyndon Avery, who has a really important part to play. And part of what he's dealing with is the fact that it's not all on him, and other people are going to have to be involved, and that he's going to have to let that go. So he's still learning lessons that he didn't quite learn in the first trilogy. And just seeing their interactions, which Lyndon, I also think, has an incredibly tragic backstory. And what was set up with her backstory made the relationship between the characters make a lot of sense, as toxic as it is in some ways with both of them, but it made it make a lot of sense. And just the description, again, because that's the thing, is even though these are fantasy and it's the fantasy people love, the real world parts in the first book really, for me, were so compelling. And in the original trilogy, we get some real world parts to start each one. This is mostly once we're there, we're there. is what we're doing here. So we don't get as much of the real world stuff, but the real world stuff we do, I think, is still really compelling. And so seeing like the flashbacks and learning about Lyndon's past, I thought were so good and super dark and twisted as well, but really, really good and just made sense. So with the new character kind of shifting the focus a little bit, it worked surprisingly well. The huge changes worked surprisingly well, and the ending, I think for me, it was really stuck with this. I just am thoroughly, thoroughly impressed by how good of a job Donaldson did here. And I think the fact that this came pretty much immediately after the first Chronicles makes a lot of sense, because this does feel like it's finishing a 6-book series and less like it's like a, hey, this is what happens later. This really does feel like this is necessary. And despite the how, final we felt in the last book, everything set up here really just works, feels like this is a natural way to continue, and has a very satisfying yet surprising end. So again, really, really impressed with this. I cannot recommend enough. If you've read the first trilogy and you enjoyed it, definitely check this out. But I think even for some people, if you had trouble with some of the elements of the first one, I think this one might work a little bit better because of some of the changes. Although our characters are still not super likable, either one of them, for the most part. We're not going to have, they're still not our normal band of heroes by any means. Covenant is kind of an anti-hero, but even then it's just, he's not super likable, and he's not really meant to be. But you can kind of, you can still root for the characters, but also I feel like the smart thing, again, that Donaldson has done is you're not even so much rooting for the characters, you're hoping that they can save the land. And so many people, when they talk about this series, especially the original trilogy, the first 3, it's the land that they fell in love with. So taking that away is such a bold choice, and seeing the land is not there, but trying to have our characters do whatever they can to bring it back, including Covenant, who's dedicated to do that, was such a compelling way to start this story. So I thoroughly, thoroughly enjoyed this. This elevated the whole series for me, and I really, really recommend checking out the second Chronicles of Thomas Covenant. I still don't know. I really do. I'm so tempted to try the last Chronicles now because I enjoyed these so much, but I've heard pretty bad things about them, and so I really don't know that I want to. If I do, it'll probably be down the line, but honestly, this is such a good ending and such a just continuation of the same sorts of themes with new things added in. With it's such a good ending. I really don't want to mess that up by continuing with the ones, because that was the final Chronicles came much later and feel like it wasn't necessarily planned and that it was going to be happening differently. So I think here was such a satisfying ending that I'm good to stop here. And so we'll see if I ever continue. But yeah, these I could not be happier with. So really, those are my thoughts on the second Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, The Unbeliever by Stephen R. Donaldson. Let me know if you've read this and or your opinions on just the series in general. I know this is one that not as many people have checked out overall, and I've heard, some people really talk about the first trilogy, but very few talk about this one overall, except when I brought it up and people tell me about it a little bit. But so absolutely worth checking out. Let me know your thoughts. I'd love to hear from you down in the comments. Make sure to give the video a like if you enjoyed it. Check the links in the description, as always, for the Patreon if you want to support what I do, as well as the Wizard of the Enclave Discord if you want to chat books, whether these books, other books, really anything at all. It's a lot of fun. We'd love to have you. And of course, if you enjoy my content, make sure to subscribe.